Outlander is one of the most popular drama series of recent years. The storyline takes us on a journey through time, reliving significant events in British and Scottish history, brought to life through unforgettable characters. One of them is, without a doubt, Geillis Duncan. Accused of witchcraft and believed to have died at the stake, she shares more in common with Claire than we initially thought. In this video, I'll tell her story chronologically, the life of Geillis and her influence on Outlander's plot. Gillian Edgars, also known as Geillis Duncan, was a recurring character in the Outlander series during the first book. Since her exact birth year is unknown, we'll start her story from the year she traveled back in time. It was 1968, and Gillian, a student at the Institute for the Study of Scottish Folklore and History, was obsessed with the standing stones of Inverness, specifically the idea of traveling to the past. Of course, it seemed like madness, but her strange fixation went beyond a mere whim. Gillian had a hidden reason, a force beyond imagination, driving her to travel through time, specifically to Jacobite Scotland. Between 1965 and 1966, Gillian met Greg Edgars through a group of Scottish nationalists, and they eventually got married. Afterward, Gillian joined the White Rose Society, a Jacobite group that, among other things, revered the king. Gillian would meet with them daily, attending the gatherings in historical costumes, sometimes even carrying swords. There they discussed in Gaelic the Jacobite uprising, what might have happened if Prince Charles had won, and debated the reasons for his defeat. When her husband, uninterested in her pursuits, urged her to spend her time on something more useful, Gillian left home, but not for good. She had been researching and gathering information on how to travel through time, listening to legends of people disappearing near the famous stone circle. She kept a journal detailing her plan, studying different dates and rituals that could help her achieve her goal. New Year's Eve, summer solstice, St. John's Eve, All Hallows' Eve, and finally, Beltane, the well-known Scottish festival. Beltane was, of course, the chosen day, but to travel through time, she needed more than just to be at the stones on that date. She had to perform a ritual. Druids burned human sacrifices in wicker cages, but usually people were strangled, and the blood was drained until the body was empty. Was it the fire or the blood that held the key? She wrote in her diary. That night, on the eve of Beltane, Gillian drove to Cray na Dun, dressed in 18th century clothing, carrying a canvas bag, and took her husband, Greg Edgars, to the stone circle. It wasn't difficult, as Greg was often drunk and could barely stand. Plus, being her husband, he loved and trusted her. After all, why wouldn't he? She was his wife, after all, obsessed with a long-dead king. Once at the site, Gillian prepared for the ritual, unsure whether she should burn or bleed Greg. So she did both. After completing the ritual, she heard voices calling to her and saw a dark-haired man seemingly coming for her. So she ran into the stone circle, disappearing through the cleft in the large stone. Gillian arrived in the 18th century, specifically in 1733. Upon arrival, she changed her name to Geillis. At some point between 1733 and 1741, Geillis married Arthur Duncan, the district's procurator fiscal in Cranesmuir, though she had no love for him. While married to him, she forged his signature several times to steal money and used local plants and herbs to make poisons, abortive teas, and love potions, gaining a reputation as a witch. Eventually, Geillis began an extramarital affair with Dougal Mackenzie, which resulted in an unwanted pregnancy. One afternoon, after drugging Claire in an attempt to investigate her identity, Geillis's husband discovered she was pregnant. And, of course, the child wasn't his. Geillis had been slowly poisoning her husband, hoping to kill him without raising suspicion. But his discovery forced her hand. Thus, Arthur Duncan died from a cyanide overdose during dinner, in front of numerous witnesses. Because of her potion-making business, the townspeople started seeing Geillis as a witch, not to mention Dougal, who wanted her out of the way. This led to her arrest and accusation of witchcraft, a crime punishable by death in that century. But Geillis wasn't alone. Alongside her, Claire was also accused, and the two shared a filthy cell for several days. During this time, Geillis revealed to Claire that she was pregnant and that Dougal Mackenzie was the father. She also explained that she had married Arthur Duncan solely to steal money for the Jacobite cause, raising £10,000 in 2 years, which she had sent to France. Finally, she confessed that she had killed her husband when he discovered her pregnancy, knowing it wasn't his, as they hadn't been intimate. At that point, neither Geillis nor Claire knew what they had in common, so there was no revelation on that subject, although Geillis had her suspicions. When Jamie arrived to rescue Claire during the witch trial, Geillis confessed that she was a witch and had enchanted Claire, freeing her from all guilt. To do so, Geillis put on a dramatic display, removing part of her clothing, revealing the smallpox vaccination scar on her arm. This revealed to Claire that, like her, Geillis was also a time traveler. As a result, Geillis was sentenced to death by burning at the stake, but her execution was delayed because she was pregnant. At some point, she managed to speak with Dougal and sent a message to Claire, one that only a person from the future could understand. 1968. Geillis gave birth to her child in her old room at Arthur Duncan's house, as Dougal had arranged for her son to be born in the best conditions. When Dougal came to take the child, Geillis threatened to kill the baby unless he saved her too. Dougal managed to bribe someone to bring another body to the stake the next day, and while it burned, Geillis watched from under a cloak, witnessing the entire scene. Shortly after, in 1744, Dougal took Geillis to Paris, where he set her up with a new identity as Melisande Robichaud. Although she wasn't part of high society, she gained a reputation as a fortune-teller. Noblewomen consulted her in secret about their love lives, pregnancies, and more. She often told them what they wanted to hear, though in some cases, she used her knowledge of the future to offer advice, such as when she suggested the name of a future child to the mother of a famous French revolutionary. 21 years later, in 1765, Geillis traveled to Jamaica from the island of Guadeloupe, where she became the wife of Barnabas Abernathy, a Scotsman who had settled in Jamaica years before. There, Geillis was known as Mrs. Abernathy, the owner of Rose Hall Plantation, where enslaved people were forced to work. 6 months later, her husband died, according to Geillis, of malaria. However, rumors circulated in town that the doctor had said it was poison. Others believed the enslaved people might have killed him, but many suspected it was Mrs. Abernathy who had poisoned her husband. In March of 1767, Geillis received an unexpected visit from Claire and Jamie, who, until that moment, had thought Geillis had died at the stake. They had come to her estate with suspicions that Jamie's nephew, Ian, was being held captive, although Geillis denied this, insisting she had no white indentured servants on her plantation, though of course she was lying. Still, Geillis had 2 enormous bodyguards named Atlas and Hercules, so she didn't feel threatened by the enslaved people or the presence of Claire and Jamie. Since her arrival in the 18th century, Geillis had capitalized on her reputation as a witch, instilling fear in the enslaved people and preventing any uprisings. During their visit, Claire tended to some of the enslaved people, only to later discover Geillis examining the photos of Brianna that Jamie always kept in his jacket pocket. The resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable, so it didn't take Geillis long to figure out the connection. And although she returned the photos to Claire at that moment, she quietly pocketed one without anyone noticing. She then invited Claire for coffee, and as they drank, she began talking about the method she had used to cross the stones. Geillis believed that fire, blood, or gemstones were necessary, and she showed Claire a box containing precious stones, while also describing the process by which she believed it would be possible to time travel again. Naturally, Geillis believed that she and Claire could pass through the stones to change things, and that was exactly her intention. Following Claire and Jamie's visit, Geillis was visited by Reverend Campbell, who told her about the prophecy of the last Fraser of Lovat, something she had been researching for a while. According to the prophecy, a new ruler of Scotland would rise from the Fraser of Lovat bloodline, descended from Simon Lovat, the old fox, Jamie's grandfather. Reverend Campbell explained that this prophecy would be fulfilled after the fall of the kings of the White Rose, meaning the Stuart kings. Since Geillis came from the future, she knew from historical records that the Lovat line officially ended around 1800. But upon discovering that there was a descendant, Brianna, in the 20th century, Geillis could use magic to fix a date for her return. A few days later, in her laboratory, Geillis performed a magical process by creating a mercury pentagram on the table, which she then burned, placing the stolen photo of Brianna in the center. After this, she left Rose Hall, heading to Abandawe in the hills of Hispaniola, taking young Ian with her. 3 days later, Jamie and Claire found her inside a dark cave in Abandawe, drawing a pentagram on the ground with diamond dust. Young Ian was tied up in the center. Once Geillis finished the drawing, she doused him with brandy and was about to set him on fire as part of the ritual to return to the 20th century. Overcome by excitement, she told Jamie and Claire that she planned to go to the future to find Brianna, who, according to her, was the last of the Lovat line, and that with her, the prophecy would be fulfilled. At this, Jamie rushed to stop her, but she shot and wounded him. That's when Claire attacked, striking Geillis with an axe and ending her life. Many years later, in 1968, her remains were found in that cave and sent to researchers in Boston, who asked Joe Abernathy for help in identifying them. Claire, who was with him at the time, held the skull in her hands and said, "She was killed. She didn't want to die."